Welcome, everybody, and it's a delight to see so many people here today to join us here for Heritage Beyond the Façade. I also would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, who are traditional custodians of this land, and I pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend respect to other Indigenous Australians present. Just to add to that, it is Indigenous Australians that have the longest links to our heritage places. And when visiting heritage places, we should always consider Indigenous people's connection to that land, which adds further depth to the importance of our heritage places and deepens our experience when visiting them. There's really three parts to the talk today. In the first part of the talk, I'll look at two examples where there was a need to focus beyond the aesthetics of a building in thinking about its heritage values. And the second part of the talk, I'll discuss some of the tools that I personally use to engage with heritage places aside from appreciating their aesthetic value. And the third part discusses how to still interpret heritage places or places that have some special meaning to us where change has occurred, or in some cases where the heritage place has been removed. I'm hoping that what you'll get out of today is to take away some tools. Hopefully it'll enhance your experience at heritage places. So this is the first part of the talk. I call it Not Just a Pretty Face. And the first example is this building here in Queen Street at the corner of Little Lonsdale Street. Some of you may recognise it, may remember it, and I'll reveal shortly what it was. But firstly, I'll talk about the plaque that's outside the building. So the plaque here, it calls the building the Records Office, which was one of its names, but the plaque really talks a lot about the aesthetics of the building. So, for example, it talks about the building being French Second Empire in style, although it doesn't actually explain what constitutes French Second Empire in style. It talks about the building's internal features, and then also talks about the architect and the date of construction. Now, I have written plaques like these before, and they're not easy to write because, as you can see, you've got a pretty limited space there to write a narrative on a building, especially a building that's had a history that goes back 120 years. So I'm not at all saying it's an easy task to write these. But having a look at this, the narrative is a little limited in telling us what's important about the place, really beyond its aesthetics. For example, the plaque tells us that records were kept here, but we're sort of left wondering, well, what records were they? Were they government records? Were they business records? Were they vinyl records? 33s, 45s? I don't know. And I think to many of us who would remember, this building was actually the Birth, Deaths and Marriages Office, and that's where those records were in fact kept. So it could have probably elaborated on that, but the interesting thing with it was that in addition to births, deaths and marriages, it was also where civil weddings were performed. And I have a photo there of members of my family, and that's my aunt and uncle who had just got married outside after the ceremony, standing in Queen Street, and that's about 1959. It's an interesting place because my uncle and aunt have different backgrounds, and it was probably they were different faiths. So it was the only place that they could probably marry. So an important place for many post-war with all the immigration. Oh, just going back to that with the birth, deaths and marriages, it's really that the plaque perhaps could quite have easily identified those aspects of it. They don't have to talk about my family's connection to it, but they could at least identify that's where records were kept and what type of records, and that even that civil wedding ceremonies were performed there. The next example, this here, is the MLC building, which was built in the 40s on the southwest corner of Elizabeth and Collins Street. And in the 1950s, after this building had been built, the MLC decided to fit on the top of their buildings weather beacons, which were electronically illuminated. And the way that the thing worked was the flashing lights represented different changes in the weather. So before the iPhone, it was a wonderful way, if you're in the middle of the city and you didn't want to have to buy a copy of the Herald and to find out what the weather was like, you could look at the MLC weather beacon. They had various colours and different ways the beacon would flash. And I suppose it was a bit complicated for some people to remember what the different flashing meant. So they had here on the left signs around the city, and in the subway of Flinders Street Station at Elizabeth Street, a sign there telling you how to read the MLC weather beacon as you walked up Elizabeth Street. And then later on, they actually had this rhyme here, and they handed out cards to people, and they could put them in their purse or their wallet, and if they were walking around the city, they could look up at the beacon and work out what the different flashing lights meant. The beacon actually became so popular that when the MLC demolished its building, which wasn't popular, nobody liked that building, particularly the Art Deco one. When they demolished that and built this one, do you know that building, the curved one? They decided to actually salvage the weather beacon and plonk it on the top of the new one. And this is the MLC annual report from about 1973, I think. Very proud of their new building that they've built in Melbourne. And they talk about how they've put the weather beacon back on the top, so Melburnians will be able to tell the weather. And it continued. I remember when I was a child, it used to flash still. I didn't actually know what the flashing meant. I knew it meant the weather, but I couldn't read it. So recently, the city of Melbourne did a study of the high-rise buildings and decided to include various skyscrapers built after the war for heritage controls. And they chose this building to nominate as one of them to protect. And I actually like it. I think it's one of my favourites. And I remember as a child seeing it for the first time. I thought it was the most bizarre thing. Come out of Darrell Lea with my mother, looked up and then, my God, look at that thing, you know? So it was put forward for controls with many other buildings. And there was a lot of debate about the building and its merits, of course, whether it should have heritage controls or not. And people were arguing that it was of value, and others were arguing it wasn't. And one of the reasons that they said the building had no heritage value anymore was the original design had changed, and that this Legoland type podium had been built at the base, and it had ruined this quite lovely curved podium there. So the panel, in their wisdom, decided, well, there's two parts to this building. There's the base, the original base, and there's the tower. So the podium's ruined the whole design, and we don't think the building's worth keeping. But I would actually argue it had three parts. And if you look at it from this angle, it's not just a podium and a tower. It's a podium, tower, and a weather beacon. And you do have to wonder about the logic where they say, well, the podium has completely destroyed the whole appearance of the building and you can no longer understand its original design intent. Well, I don't know if they realise, but I kind of see there are about 28 floors of an intact facade. And on the right you can see the weather beacon. That's it at night. And you can see, there's Flinders Street Station. And I can remember this also, that used to stand on some of the platforms and you'd get that view. You could see the beacon from the platforms flashing. So that brings us really to part two, and it's about ways to engage with heritage places beyond the facade and beyond aesthetics. And this is what I call the handshake. And whenever I go to visit a building, I for some reason, I've always done it. And I'm not saying you should go and do it as well, it's just mine personally, but I always touch it. I don't know why. It's important to touch things. And when I arrived today, you'll remember this, I thought that was marble. And I was like, oh my God, there's marble here. That's amazing. And then I found it's some sort of synthetic, I don't know. So it's really important to touch things and touch buildings because you just get this extra dimension or engagement with the building. So I call it the handshake. If I'm standing outside a building in Collins Street and I'm looking at it, I suppose it's the aesthetic that's originally drawn my attention to it, but I always go up and touch it. I don't know why, I just have to sort of touch that material. So that's something I suggest thinking about. Be careful what you touch. I have been told off in museums for touching things, so try that. And it's sort of, I find when I'm thinking about a building, when I've done that, when I'm thinking about a building, and when you go home and you sort of picture the building and you're thinking about the way it looked, your mind actually goes, oh yeah, the stone, had this texture to it like this. And it sort of adds to your experience that you've had. So that's not me about to rob a bank or anything there, but touching things grew for me after I attended a seminar in Amsterdam, and a group of Argentinian architects, they wanted to highlight how we concentrate so much on our built environment when we're designing it, on the aesthetic. And they wanted to demonstrate to us that we need to look beyond the aesthetic when we're designing and think about other sensory things as touch, smell, and so forth. And they took us on the seminar on a walk through Amsterdam, blindfolded, and you can see the sheer look of terror on my face that I'm worried I'm about to go into a canal, but took us around where we experienced touching the sides of buildings that we passed, the smell. Like they said that the canals even have a smell that sort of comes from them, and other things like that. So it was a great seminar. It was one of my favourite seminars I've ever been to. And it made me sort of think, well, how do we take these and apply them to heritage places, these sort of ideas of sensory things, but not the visual? So when I came back, I started looking at the heritage places in Melbourne that I visit and thinking about other aspects of them that were sort of more sensory. And here we have Hosier Lane, which I think all of you will be familiar with. And it's one of my favourite places. And it's a place that, of course, we go to see the street art. I mean, it's prime focus. But what I didn't realise with it was that it's something that contributes to that experience is that bluestone, sort of cobblestone lane surface. And depending on how thick the soles are on your shoes, gives you this lovely feeling, sort of like a massage of your feet. It's also a little bit uneven, and you kind of have to watch a bit how you're walking in that lane. And it sort of contributes to that edginess of the lane with this graffiti and the street art. And then you're sort of, even as you're walking, you're taking sort of this in as well, and it contributes to that edginess. And I think if perhaps that lane, the bluestone, was removed and they just put, asphalt, it would really ruin the experience that you have there of the lane, both visually, but also that tactile sort of experience. And I think the same, this is at Federation Square, the same with the stone blocks, and they're quite uneven, and they also go on various angles. So as you walk through Federation Square, there's different slopes, not sort of even. And again, you get quite a sensation sort of on your feet, depending again whether you've got thick soles or not. But say with Converse runners, you do feel that sensation in it, and it contributes to your experience when you're going to Fed Square. Now, the National Gallery of Victoria is an interesting one, I think, because it's sort of a bit of a paradox that for a place that relies so heavily on the visual, so artwork, going to look at artwork, the building itself sort of exudes these sensory things that contribute to going to the building and exploring it. Again, one of my favourite places. As a child, it's one of the buildings that really enchanted me. I remember going there with my mother, and to me it was like a castle, and exploring this sort of castle. And I thought it was a fantastic place just by the time, I think at the first time I went shortly after it opened, I was 4 or 5, and I was mesmerised. So that's the moat outside and the fountain in the moat. That's just when you're walking down St Kilda Road. And water seems to play a theme in the design of that gallery, that water is used in various ways or references to water. Here, it's quite interesting that as you're walking down St Kilda Road and you walk past this fountain, you're even starting to be taken into another world. And that's what I used to find with that gallery. It was like going into another world. And it even begins as you're walking down St Kilda Road, because that fountain, it starts to drown out all the noise of the city, and you can't hear the cars and the trams and the trucks and buses. All you hear is the water, and it starts to take you to another place. And I'll just play it again for you. So apart from the person you can hear talking in the background, it blocks out all that noise of the city. And before you've even arrived at the gallery, you're starting to be taken to another place. And the water wall is the same, that it has this sensory thing that, sure, we like looking at it, but most Melbourne's want to touch it. Everyone touches it and wants to rub their hand on it. So there's the sound of the water running down the wall. Of course, there's the visual of the water. But there's also that thing we want to do where we want to touch the water. And usually I get my sleeves all wet when I do that, but that's part of that experience. And that's a very old photo there. That's of the gallery just after it opened in 1960. It opened in 68, so that's been taken in 69. And even then, people, when they went to look at the Leonard French ceiling, would lie on the ground and look up, and that was seen as the way to do it. And of course the ceiling is meant to, or so some people say, is that it's like looking up if you're underwater, seeing light coming through, and that's what the ceiling is meant to be like. And the best way to do that is lying on the floor of the Great Hall. So that's a sort of a different way of experiencing something. But all of these things, the three things I just talked about, they really contribute to that experience we get. And the National Gallery is a heritage place, but it goes beyond just the building and the way it looks and its contents, but the way we travel through it. And I think if we were told, for example, if we went to the National Gallery one day and a guard came up to us and said, no, you can't touch the water wall, get your hands off it, or you can't lie on the floor, stand up, you'd be pretty upset, because that's something we've been doing for 50 years at the National Gallery. So these are all things that contribute to this heritage place. Now, this is another Melbourne icon, which is Pellegrini's. And I noticed in The Age a few months back that it had won an award, a design award, and rightly so, for its 1950s. It said interior. I also think the exterior is very 50s, but its interior, and there's a photo there. But I sort of think about, when I go there, I think about other things that really create Pellegrini's or make Pellegrini's, and if anything, non-tangible things. And they're not, they're sort of, I don't think of the stools being sort of 1950s, oh, that's Pellegrini's. But the things are sort of more non-tangible that I think, and you may actually think of others, but hearing Italian being spoken by the staff that work there is one of the things that I recall. Italian food being cooked and served there, and the smell of food and the smell of coffee and the noise. It's a very, very noisy space. And some of the noise is the espresso machine being used there. You can see it just there in the photo. And just the constant movement of people through the space. So people sort of a very narrow space having to sort of push past and to get down to the back or to leave or whatever. And it's almost got this theatrical quality to it when you go there. It's like a sort of theatre, some sort of scene. And thinking about Pellegrini's, its heritage value, that you could leave the 50s decor, but if you took out all those things and you turned it into some sort of cruisy jazz bar that you went and sat and listened to jazz music in this 50s, it somehow wouldn't be as much value. It wouldn't be the same. And that it's a lot of the value of Pellegrini's and what we love about it are actually non-tangible things. And it's not the vinyl stools and the vinyl floor and so forth. That's just part of it. So we go into part 3, and that's remembering places altered or gone. And this is a lovely photo, but it's also got a sad side to it as well. But I thought it's a great introduction to this section, and where we're going to be talking about, well, how do we remember places that are no longer there? So as I understand, this is a Vogue shoot done in New York City in the early 60s. And I think it's a wonderful photo. And the sad thing is that the day after the photo was taken, they demolished the building. So that's why the models can all stand in the windows, because the windows have been taken out. There's just the window opening, and that's why they're all being able to stand on the ledge and so forth. So just as an introduction to this section, I suppose we sort of begin with the question, well, what remains now that provides us with a connection to this building? And some of the things are, of course, the photograph gives us a visual reminder of the building. And there's also living memory. So there would be some of the models there, some of the people there that would still be alive. And if you could track them down, they'd be able to tell you about that day and what the building was like, what the photo shoot was like. Did everyone get along, or were there arguments? Whatever. Was it a great day? Was it a successful shoot? So there's that. There's people's memory of it. And another thing too is that although the building's gone, its site remains somewhere. Somewhere in New York City, its site is still there. So you might even be able to find the street that building was once on and the exact place that it once stood. So there's even that connection that you could find. So as I said, photographs are a wonderful source of information about places that have gone. And the article I wrote on the State Savings Bank of Victoria's head office in Elizabeth Street, I think many of you will remember it. It was on the corner diagonally to the post office at Burke Street. And the bank took hundreds and hundreds of photos of this building, of both the exterior and of the interior, lots of the interior. And I even found a photo of my aunt who worked there, which was amazing. But what I found when I was looking through the photos was there's just very little narrative on the photos, and you're left guessing at times, especially with the interior spaces. Where were these in the building? Where were these places? There's no indication of it. So that sort of lessens the value, say, of this photo here on the right, which is a fantastic photo. I love this photo so much. But it doesn't tell us, say, where was that in the building? And even who were those people that you see in the building? I think it just says what department it was in. So really, I think it's important for all of us that have memory of places, of heritage places, or even just places that were special for you, that you write down those and you share those memories with people. Because with photographs, that written memory really assists with us sort of looking at places that are gone. When you've got someone that could tell you exactly what that place was like, almost walk you through that building. And my parents, they both could do that. They used to have these wonderful stories that they would tell you. And my father could walk me through a building and tell you sort of what it was like. And I think it's important that we try to record our memories of places for future generations. Names I find are really useful because they often give a bit of a hint about the history of a place or some association. And the example I'll use here is that this lane runs off Queensbury Street in Carlton, and it's called Snowball Lane. And for years I was thinking, why would you name a lane in Melbourne that, a place that hardly ever gets snow? Why would you name it Snowball Lane? Was it some freak event that happened there where a snowball was found in 1952 or something that they called it that? And then one day I decided to sort of look into it, and it turned out that it's named after a Dr. Snowball. And that's him. Dr. Snowball was the father of paediatrics in Melbourne in the 19th century and was instrumental in the founding of the Royal Children's Hospital. And the Royal Children's Hospital, as I said, the lane is in Carlton, just off Queensbury Street near Drummond Street. And the lane is actually halfway, almost halfway between what used to be the site of the old Royal Children's Hospital, which was opposite the exhibition buildings in Rathdown Street, and Dr. Snowball's private practice, which was down in Victoria Street. So the lane sort of sits sort of halfway between that. So names are really interesting when you start to explore them and you see a name on a building or so forth, and you look into that, it often reveals quite a history of a place. So that's one thing to explore. One of my favourites is fragments. I love it when you find a fragment of a building that's gone, and it gives you this connection with the building that's no longer around. You get this little piece of it. And I have a collection of things at home that I've collected from, but just little things. So I have a bit of marble from the old National Mutual building, from the Façade, the AXA National Mutual building, a beautiful marble they had on it, and a builder gave me a piece, just a little piece. But it's nice, I've got this sort of connection with the building. But there's even, of course, there's the famous one outside the Melbourne Museum of the Equitable building, and there's a lot of argument about that. Well, it's not on its original site, and it's lessened its value. It should really be where the Equitable building was in Collins Street. But this one here is an example, and it's a very discreet example, and that's why the more discreet the better. I love them when you find these, of this building here, which was the Australian building, which was on the corner of Flinders Lane and Elizabeth Street, and it was Melbourne's tallest building for many years. I think probably even up to the time ICI was built, it was Melbourne's tallest building. And it was so tall when it was built, it horrified the authorities, and that's when they put the height limit in. They said, we won't have anything this tall again. So, as you can see, it's quite a high building for a building built about 1890. So if you walk down Elizabeth Street, you can find that part of its side wall is still there. And you can just see it here. It's not a very good slide, but see how it's light grey and then dark grey? Well, the dark grey part is the building's side wall. And it has some of the moulding left on the wall from the facade. But the interesting thing with it is that it gives us a sense of just how high that building was, because the top of that, what remains, is only about probably just under a half of the height of the building there. So as you can see, it was a pretty tall building. So scale of the buildings they were building in Chicago and New York there. So that's great when you can find these sort of fragments. It gives you this connection or something to connect with something that's gone. Does anyone remember that building? Wasn't knocked down that long ago. It was 40 years ago. In the early 80s, they pulled it down. It's a real shame. So in remembering places that are altered or gone, other things you can look at: topography, the original landscaping may survive of a site. And when I said topography before, I meant, the fall of the land remains the same often, the street remains the same, and so forth. Even street furniture, power poles. I know a friend of mine went to see his old house in Adelaide, and it had been demolished, but the Stobie pole was still out the front of the house that he used to roller skate around, and it was great. He thought, there's some connection to my old house still here. It's a power pole. It's always here. So things like that, they give you a sense of connection. I'll use my example. This is King Street, Melbourne, looking south from Little Collins Street. So that's the east side of King Street. And our family had a business there. And no, it wasn't a strip club, which King Street is famous for today. It was the antithesis of that. It was a customs and shipping brokerage. You couldn't get anything more boring. Anyway, I spent a lot of my time here because after school I'd go and my father would drive me home and sort of hang around here. And King Street, even then, prior to the strip clubs, was pretty seedy, I must say. And for a wayward boy coming of age, it probably wasn't the best place for my father to tell me to go away. I'm busy, go and hang out in the street. So I have a lot of fond memories of that part of town. So that whole block of that street has gone and it was redeveloped. Every building was wiped out, and I think it's 530 Collins is the building that stands there. So that's on the northeast corner of Collins and King Street. And it goes all the way up to Little Collins. And when I was preparing this lecture, I went back. I knew the buildings had all gone, but I thought, look, I'll go back. And, using this Stobie pole metaphor, I'll see what I can find that's still here that I remember about King Street in the 1970s. So I went back and I thought, look, I'll see what's there that triggers my memory of this place. And I did find things, and it was really lovely because you could remember, oh yeah, I remember that. So I talked about topography, and with the street, it always had that incline. So when you got to Collins Street, it inclined up, and then when it got to Little Collins, it went flat. And that's still there, of course. So the street still has that same topography in it. And I used to annoy me, so I had to walk up that hill. And then the other thing that's still there is the plane trees. And the plane trees used to create this, as they do today, this lovely canopy of green over that street. And it was in those days, a horrible street. And it was just led to Kingsway, and you had trucks and everything going down there. And I remember that if you were sort of in the upper level of his building, you looked out, you'd see this beautiful canopy of green. And it sort of shielded you away from all of that horrible sort of traffic, and also muffled the noise a little bit. And I was thinking, well, even though the building's gone, the people who now work in these buildings, they'd be getting that same experience. That they'd look out their window and see that same really lovely canopy of green over King Street. Now, I've got one more thing I found, and this is really wacky, but I think you'll like it. There was always this electrical services box at the corner. 1972's that photo, and that's a green City of Melbourne electrical services box, and lo and behold, it's still there with all that change. And you know what's even weirder about it? And here's your rates at work here. It's still on an angle, and as you can see in the photo in 1972, it's on a slight angle. Obviously it'd been knocked over, bumped or something by a car or a truck, and it's still on an angle. So there's your rates at work. They haven't got around to that yet, but they will someday. So that's what I found, and I always remember that was there at the corner. So just these things that sort of, the small innate objects, they do give you this sense of place still. And to me, it was a very special place. That part of town, I have very fond memories of it. So that really brings us towards the end of today's talk, but I have just some things that if you want further reading. One of them is Robin Annear, one of my favourite authors, and she writes about Melbourne so beautifully, and she loves all this sort of stuff of talking about Melbourne years ago, and she finds all these wonderful stories. And her book Adrift in Melbourne has, I think, several walking tours of the city, and she talks about places they're no longer there, but she'll talk about, say, a place or a person that occupied a building 100 odd years ago. The next one is David Sornig wrote a book called Blue Lake, Finding Dudley Flats in the West Melbourne Swamp. And it's that wasteland that sort of is between, if you're travelling on Dynon Road and you sort of leave North Melbourne, and then there's this wasteland, sort of swampy wasteland, industrial. And he writes about this and talks about that landscape. And in the 30s, it was a shanty town. In the Depression, people went and lived down there, and the City of Melbourne had a rubbish tip and disposed of building materials and things like that, and people would scavenge them, and they were living down there on the Dudley Flats. And there's the river, I think the Maribyrnong River goes through it. He really recreates the whole history of this landscape that's gone, that's just disappeared, and talks about, I think it's a narrative through three different people that lived down there around that time. So that's a great book to read, and I recommend that. And then the other one is Urbanismo Vivo, and that's the people that took me on that wonderful tour of Amsterdam. And you can have a look at their website, and they're based in Buenos Aires, but they show their work there and they do similar things. They're a very interesting group of architects. So I thought this was a really good end to the talk. It's a good metaphor, I think. Recently, they removed the 1960s curtain wall, glass steel curtain wall off a building, and look what they found underneath, a beautiful 1920s office building with a Spanish Baroque facade in that. But what people had thought was a building that they dismissed as, it's probably only, 50, 60 years old and a dime a dozen. It's actually a building that was 100 years old and had a whole history to it that went back 50 years further. And I think it's a great metaphor for today's talk, and that's really about when we're out and about looking at the city, looking at heritage places, or any place, not just heritage place, any place. Peel back the facade and have a good look at the place, and don't just sort of look at its face value. Think about all these other things and the history that, say, the place contains. And in doing that, it'll really add value to your experience when you going around the city and when you're visiting heritage places or places special to you, if you look at them in a broader way. And finally, I just wanted to dedicate, this is a bit personal, but I wanted to dedicate Heritage Beyond the Facade today to my father who passed away last week. So this is dedicated to him and King Street.